topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the hosts and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
Welcome to the Ask Good Questions podcast, broadcasting live every Wednesday, 6 p.m. Eastern Time on W4CY Radio at W4CY.com. This week and every week, we will reach for a higher purpose in money and life, as well as a focus on health and wellness. Now, let's join your host, Bonita Bell Anderson, as together we start with Asking Good Questions.
Welcome to the Ask Good Questions podcast. My name is Bonita Bell Anderson, and today I have an extra special guest with me. Actually, I will explain that a little further when I invite him onto the podcast stage. So I'd like to welcome Dalton Forsyth. What everyone doesn't know is that Dalton and I are partners in the registered investment advisory firm that we are in together. And Dalton is my long-term plan for the next 50 years. So anyway, welcome, Dalton.
Thank you.
So let me tell you a little bit about this boy. He's just a few years younger than me. And I was telling him that I used to come up to his shoulder. Well, it's gotten worse because I think I've lost an inch in height, and so I look like a pipsqueak compared to him because he's so much bigger than me. But he is a graduate of Utah State University with a bachelor's degree in finance and economics and a minor in real estate. He also played offensive line for the Utah State University football team and was named a two-time Whiteside Scholar athlete. He's a board member for the Inclusive Sports Foundation, the 2024 California Nonprofit of the Year. He also sits on the board for the Blue A Collective. We're going to be talking about NIL today. It is a nonprofit collective dedicated to providing a competitive edge in the NIL space for Utah State athletics. So professionally, he focuses on investment coaching, as I do, and helps his clients understand what really drives investment results. He brings solutions that couple Nobel Prize winning investing principles with behavior management. And he currently resides in northern Utah. I'm in southern Utah, St. George at the moment, so we're on opposite ends of the state. His wife, Maddie, and him have 4 children. They have 3 little girls that have him wrapped around their little fingers, and then they just had a little boy. He must be about 3 months old now.
Yep, almost 4 months.
Wow. So he enjoys spending time outdoors, golfing, and traveling with his family. So welcome.
Thank
So
you.
we're going to talk about something that has been fascinating. And I actually hear this brought up every once in a while. It's just weird. And maybe it's because we're doing this today that my ears hear it. But what in the heck is NIL?
Yeah, so I'll give you a little bit of history as we talk through this. So you mentioned that I played college football. My last year on roster was 2016. So I started in 2011, played my years. I also went on a mission in the middle of that. And one of the pretty critical pieces about playing college sports previously is that you were considered an amateur, which means you weren't getting paid, right? There was a big distinction between amateur athlete and professional athlete. So you think college athlete, NFL, right? And as an example, every year in fall camp, they would send in a compliance person, and the compliance person would tell you, this is kind of a silly example, but like, hey, let's say you're walking down the street, you're going to McDonald's, and a donor pulls over and says, hey, hop in, I want to give you a ride to McDonald's. Okay. What are you supposed to say? Well, you're supposed to say, no, that's an impermissible benefit. It doesn't come from the school, and it's kind of like receiving a benefit from a donor. And that's how strict it was. And in the past, you've seen athletes get hammered pretty hard because they were signing footballs or basketballs or jerseys and selling them and whatever else it was. And you've seen guys like Reggie Bush. Reggie Bush lost his Heisman because he used his own name, image, and likeness to make money while he was in college, right? And effectively, the NCAA used to say that jeopardized your status as an amateur. What's ended up happening over the last, 15 years, let's call it, is it started with a guy, his name was Ed O'Bannon, and he played basketball, I want to say for UCLA. I might be off on that, but he started a lawsuit in 2009. And basically he said, hey, you guys are putting out these video games. There's the NCAA basketball games. There's the NCAA football games. And like, I can see myself in your game. Like there's a player with my name on his back on UCLA's roster, and you guys are making money off of my name, image, and likeness. Why can't I? And honestly, that was a great point. It was a great question. That lawsuit, I want to say, took like 5 years, and it got settled in 2014. And basically, the ruling was that the NCAA was violating antitrust law, that you cannot bar an athlete, a U.S. citizen, from using their own name, image, and likeness to make money for themselves. And basically, what started to fall apart was the NCAA's ability to say, if you're going to play inside of our system, you can't make money off of your name, image, and likeness because it threatens your amateurism status, right? That's what started to fall apart for them. You've had other things come up in the last 5 or 10 years. I think some of it comes from the fact that, if you look at how much college coaches are getting paid, it's not in every sport, but football and basketball, you can see college coaches getting $1 or $2 or $3 or $4 million a year contracts to come in and coach. But then you have these all-star kids on their team that are either getting them into the college football playoffs, getting them into good bowl games, running them deep into March Madness. And at that point in time, those kids couldn't get compensated. So you started to see a huge disparity there, right? How are schools and coaches making millions of dollars a year off of these athletes, but the athletes get nothing?
Yeah.
You started
taking advantage of them.
What's that?
Well, they're taking advantage of the athlete.
Yeah. And I think if you were to ask the average college athlete, that's what the relationship felt like, right? It's like, okay, yes, we get a scholarship for school. Yes, you get some food, whatever it is. But the reality is you're expected to show up in your sport like a job. You don't have time to go out and do other stuff. You don't have time to have a real job. And it's like, outside of going to school, you spend most of your time at a stadium, in a locker room, in a weight room, in a nutrition room, whatever else it is. That realistically is your job. So there's been some other rulings that have come out in 2021. There was another guy named Alston that basically sued the NCAA again and won. Claimed the NCAA was violating antitrust laws once again by limiting like education-related expenses. So now kids can get something that's called Alston money through the university to help them cover other education-related expenses. And then effectively in July of 2021, the NCAA adopted, I think, what most people are calling an interim policy at this point, that allowed athletes in any of the NCAA divisions to profit from their name, image, and likeness. Okay? And I think the initial thought was that it was going to give a football player or a basketball player or a soccer player or whatever it is the ability to go out and market themselves. And like, if you could sell an autographed football and make some money, great. That's fine. If you could sell some autographed jerseys or posters or whatever it was and make yourself some extra money, that's great. And I think that was the heart of it. Like, you can do endorsement deals. You could get paid to promote businesses on social media. You could actually appear in commercials and get compensated for it. You could run your own independent sports camps and get compensated for it, and whatever else it is. And really the only laws or regulations that you were expected to follow were the laws of the state you were in.
Wow.
Okay. The issue that's ended up creating the last couple of years is the NCAA is like a national institution. And so the laws that exist here in Utah are different than the laws in California, are different than the laws in Texas, are different than the laws in Florida. And so to a certain extent, even though you're all competing in the college athletic space, where your institution is located and how your state's legislature has handled the NIL space actually greatly affects how a player can make name, image, or likeness money. And realistically, it's also affecting schools' ability to recruit.
Right. Wow. You can see that.
Yeah.
Recruiting would influence where those kids want to go to school.
Exactly. Right. Because conceptually, you can understand that if there's someone who is thinking of going to two different schools, but there's one state that's exempting NIL from income tax, I'm not going to say which state it is, and there's another state that's making you pay income tax on NIL money. Well, there's a 6 or 7 or 8% benefit if the numbers are the same, choosing one school versus the other. Okay. And so states have chosen to address NIL in different ways. And like you said, it really changes how schools can, basically recruit or entice people to stay. Okay. What's ended up happening in a lot of schools and in a lot of places is that it became a really difficult process for a student athlete to go out and approach a brand, make themselves marketable, come to terms with a brand, right? Because you essentially have to negotiate a contract, and a lot of kids don't know how to do that. Okay. Follow up on your contract. So whatever it is, you got to show up a certain amount of times, deliver a certain amount of digital content, make a certain amount of posts, whatever it is. And then to make sure you get paid. And then if you don't get paid, how are you going to go after them, right? What sort of legal recourse do you have? And then it's just opened up a whole new world for these kids. Then you're figuring out self-employment income. And then you're figuring out how do you take deductions because you're technically running a business now. And,
well, what about school? What about getting educated?
That's a great question.
Seems like that's going on, thrown away almost.
Yeah, and it's very different because if you look at 10 years ago, where you're going to school was actually a much bigger part of the recruiting process, right? Because, let's say you're looking at Utah versus Stanford, right? Mm-hmm. Two very different locations, two very different sorts of universities. 10 years ago, a consideration for someone who was looking way down the road might be, would I be better suited in life if I had a degree from Stanford or a degree from Utah?
Right.
Okay? The reality for student athletes now is you don't even know where you're realistically going to get a degree from, because if you look at basketball as an example, there are student athletes that in their 5 years of eligibility have played at 5 different schools.
Yeah.
Okay. Because the other thing that happened while NIL was coming on is that the transfer portal got wide open. Okay. It used to be that you could transfer 1 or maybe 2 times, and there was rules and those sorts of things. And if you transferred, you typically had to sit out a year. Right. And so, I went to a junior college first, and I graduated from a junior college, so I was allowed to transfer, and then I played at Utah State. Well, you see kids now that transfer every year or sometimes twice a year if they feel like it.
Wow.
And that's completely permissible.
Yeah. It's just a
So,
whole new world.
Yeah. And education is still a component in that you still have to make grades to stay on a roster, right? But it's not the primary focus for a lot of these athletes.
No. Right.
And I think when you look at the type of money some of these athletes are making, it would probably be beneficial in the long run to try and do away with the idea of amateurism. Like, a lot of these kids are getting paid like professionals. And frankly, we should probably start to treat them like professionals. And I think you and I will end up talking about this a little later on, but they're getting money like professionals, but they're not getting resources like professionals, right?
Right.
And what I mean by that is if you go to the NFL, there's a players association and there's financial planners that are part of the PA.
Right.
And they have resources to assist you in managing your wealth and managing your family and managing your estate. But now what you're seeing in the collegiate landscape is there's a kid that might be getting 6 or 7 figure checks every year, and they don't have resources. There is no players association.
Yeah. Dangerous.
Yeah.
Well, I'm wondering how are the schools must be thinking about how are they prepared to help athletes navigate this successfully, financially as well as with their education. There's got to be turning the schools upside down.
Yeah, it is. So April 7th, not that long ago, was the beginning. Well, not the beginning, but it's when they started to try and decide on a lawsuit that's been in the House for some number of months. And you effectively have groups petitioning the federal government to standardize the landscape for NIL. Okay. And what they're considering doing is a couple of different things, but one of the biggest ones is they're allowing what's called revenue sharing. And this is something that's never been available. And what that means is that if a school, or very specifically an athletic department, is generating enough revenue and they choose to opt in, that the school can actually revenue share with an athlete. Okay? And what that means is it brings some of the control back into the school. Okay. They can see how much revenue is being generated. You can see how much money is being paid out to athletes, right? And now you have some disclosure. The reason that's important, and I'll back up a teeny bit, is what's happened at most schools, including at Utah State and most every other school, is that when the athletes tried to go out and negotiate independent contracts and manage their own name, image, and likeness, that was like an overwhelming task for the majority of those student athletes, right? Almost
like
impossible.
20.
Yeah. I mean, some of them, I met with a volleyball player yesterday. She's 17. She's already here at school.
Gosh. Yeah. Yeah.
The point of that, though, is what's happened at most schools is they've started some sort of NIL collective. And depending on the school you look at, the landscape is going to be really different. The amount of resources they have is going to be really different. But in my mind, the gist of a collective is that the collective acts as an intermediary between student athletes and businesses or private donors. Okay. And so I'm part of our collective. Like I said, most schools have a collective these days. And effectively what we're doing is we're going to our athletes and we're contracting to buy up their name, image, and likeness. And then some of us that have more financial or business experience, we turn around and we go out to the public and we look for wealthy individuals, businesses who want partnerships, advertising, those sorts of things. And we act as the intermediary. Okay? Wow. So we're finding and sourcing money in deals, and we're taking the athletes for which we own their name, image, and likeness, and we're plugging them into them. Okay. And so we've taken some of this off of the athletes' plates so that they can benefit from name, image, and likeness, meaning they can get compensated, but they don't have to do the majority of the heavy lifting, right? You don't have to start your own marketing agency from scratch. Okay. Going back to what are schools doing about it? Well, our collective, as most collectives are, they're not actually part of the university. Okay. And I think one of the challenges for universities and for fan bases and for donors to schools alike is that some collectives are pretty transparent, but I think most collectives are not in terms of how much money is being raised, how much money is being deployed, right? There's not really an advantage for a collective to share those sorts of numbers because it's kind of like a tactical advantage. You don't want people to know what you're doing for athletes or not doing.
Right.
And so most people kind of keep it to themselves. So going back to that House settlement, they're allowing schools to revenue share. And I think their hope is that, number one, there's a cap. There's a concern right now that the amount of money that's being expended on rosters is just unsustainable or even unfair.
Right.
And so I'm going to test your knowledge. Bonnie, do you know who won the football championship last year in college? Do you remember?
Well, it was UConn.
No, for football.
No, for football. I know because of March. I mean,
That's okay.
But
So
football,
it was Ohio State.
Okay. I didn't remember that.
That's okay. So the Ohio State Buckeyes, they won the national championship last year, and it's a bit of a longer road now because you have to win playoff games to get to the national championship. It's not like before. Do you care to take a guess at what Ohio State spent on NIL just to put their roster together?
Oh, I bet. Well, I'm sure it's in the millions, right? Do you know what's the number?
Yeah, and it's an estimation because I think a lot of this doesn't have to get disclosed still. But most of what I heard is that Ohio State spent between $25 and $26 million on their football roster in a single year.
Where does that money come from? Yeah. That's what I want to know.
Yeah. So the money largely comes from wealthy donors and business owners, right? And the NCAA doesn't like it, but the system, if you look at it throughout the entirety of the country, the reality is it's almost become a pay-to-play system.
Yeah.
So you've asked questions that a lot of people commonly ask, right? Where does school fit into this? What about the education? What about the degree? Whatever else. Well, the reality is when you think about, this is a $25 or $26 million roster, school is one of their very last concerns.
Yeah, I can see that.
Right? And you can see it happening again. I mean, we're in Utah. BYU made a good run, made it to the Sweet 16 this year. I mean, everything I've seen indicates that BYU might spend between $15 and $20 million on their basketball team next year.
I was thinking about this as I'm watching March Madness and watching these teams. And I don't know, I guess it was like I was watching Alabama and NIL, actually the announcers, a couple of times in just their conversation, this comes up, the whole NIL thing. Yeah.
It's a major piece of it. And, a statistic I've heard in basketball is that if you expect your team to make any sort of run in the March Madness tournament, that you should expect to spend between $6 and $8 million on your roster. That's just how it's working these days. Right?
So it's almost like not, it's just like it's not so much merit anymore. It's not. I mean, it's like the schools are buying their athletes.
Yeah, and I think to a certain extent that's fair. Yeah. And so with all of these collectives and associations being independent of the school, the House settlement that's going on right now is attempting to standardize that and push it back into the schools if possible, right? And I think where that makes a difference is at least the institutions will have some level of oversight, and the NCAA will probably maintain some level of oversight, where right now the reality to me is it feels like the Wild West. People are doing whatever, people are saying whatever, and I think some of them know, there's going to be something to pay someday, or we're going to have to figure this out, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there.
So walk me through this. I'm a high school football quarterback that has done really well.
Yeah.
What's going to happen? I mean, and that guy is saying, I want to go play football in college.
Yep.
Who's going to be reaching out to him?
Yes. I mean, it's still, I think at most schools, it kind of works in two ways, but the coaches are still the ones evaluating talent and assessing talent, right? So your coaches and their staff, they're going out, they're watching film, they're looking at huddle, they're going to games, they're, if it's other sports, it's like they're going to tournaments or AAU teams or whatever it is, and they're evaluating the talent. But the question that most college coaches have is, how much money can we spend, right? How much money can I spend on this roster? And even though a college coach can probably go out and find some donors and, speak or do whatever else it is, it's effectively the collective's job or the school's job, depending on the situation, to make sure they have enough NIL money to fill the roster. Because like we talked about in the beginning, let's say you're this elite high school quarterback. Well, number one, you want to play at a good school probably, right? So you want to go to an Ohio State or a Texas or whatever else it is. If you want to be at a big powerhouse school. But the second question, and it usually doesn't even have to get brought up by the coach or the NIL collective or someone else. The parent or the athlete is asking, what's the NIL landscape at your school? What's the capacity of your NIL collective? What sort of businesses can you introduce my children to or my child to or my son to? And that's almost like a big piece of the recruiting process for a lot of people. And, you can see it, the basketball transfer portal window, it goes on basically during the March Madness tournament and through the majority of April. And you see kids in the transfer portal because they were promised more money by another school. And so that's why there's not a lot of brand loyalty or not even a lot of concern about where do I get my degree from, because players who play at a high level can go from one school to another year over year, making 2 or 5 or 10 times as much money. And that's almost one of the only factors in getting them to move.
Well, and so is there even like a football scholarship to give you a full ride scholarship to the school? Because if the education's taking a back seat, I wonder if they even care anymore.
Yeah, so these kids are still getting scholarships and they're still getting your standard stuff. So, it's the education is getting paid for. Most schools pay a stipend that they're hoping will cover the cost of a house or an apartment, basically your housing and then some food and your books and that sort of stuff. So that still does get paid for. But I think when you're talking about the elite athletes in any sport that are going to college, it used to be that like getting a scholarship was the highest form of reward, right? You had certain kids that had to walk onto a team.
That used to be the big deal.
Yeah, and the full ride was the big deal. Like you said, it was like, man, I made it, right? Now it's like the full ride is the floor. No one even wants to talk about it, right? It's just expected. Everyone kind of knows generally what it's going to entail. But the questions are, what's the capacity for your NIL collective to give, and what sort of businesses or donors can you put my son or daughter in front of?
Wow. Are the parents or the athlete coached on, the name of this podcast is Ask Good Questions. How do they know? Are they just being coached on what to ask?
Yeah. And so this is another one that's been,
it's interesting.
Yeah. This is another one that's been tough to navigate. And I think this is part of what the House settlement is also trying to address, is that when you look at professional sports, there are laws and or regulations that govern who can be an agent in the professional sports world. Like you have to be an actual attorney to be an agent in the NFL, as an example. Okay. When you talk about NIL agents, there are legitimately kids getting multi-million-dollar contracts. There's kids in the state of Utah that have $6 or $7 million contracts with their respective universities, for a year. And so obviously those are big contracts. You probably should have an agent. You probably should have an attorney. You probably should have an advisor. You probably should have a good CPA. Like you should have a whole team if you're getting that kind of money at that age. But the reality is for NIL, where NIL is still in basically its infancy, it's still the Wild West, there is no standard for who can be an NIL agent. Okay. And the reason that's made things difficult is, number one, there's people that put themselves out as NIL agents that they're taking almost predatory amounts of these kids' contracts, 20 or 25.
Yeah, there's no certification or anything.
No, and there's no standardization either. So they're taking big chunks of these kids' money, right? Number two is there's some agents that do a good job They help market their players. They help get them to the right school. They help negotiate a good contract, and I think that's awesome. But there's some other agents that, in my opinion, their only value proposition is they're telling these kids, get into the transfer portal, right? Threaten the school you're at. Tell them you need double the money or triple the money or you're leaving, and see how it goes. Right? They'll probably give you a little bit more to try and retain you. So that creates a bad situation for the team and for the school. And it's not a fun dynamic for a coach to have to deal with either, right?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, that makes me think about the dynamics of the coach trying to build the team.
Yeah. And I mean, that's something we can touch on too. But the flip side of it is then you have some kids that do that, and the school they're at says, I know some schools that are adopting policies. I'm pretty sure Coach Sanders at Colorado has said the same, that if you test the transfer portal, you're never coming back, right? He doesn't deal in what feels to me like the extortion game of like, well, if you don't pay me, I'm going to transfer. His answer is bye.
Right.
If you don't want to be in Colorado, well.
Yeah, there's like a whole ethical thing going on here.
And so, like you said, it also affects the ability for a coach to manage a team, right? Because now you have kids trying to negotiate against their own coach to get more money. And that's tough. And then the other thing is some of these negotiations are very public. Okay. Mm-hmm. And the reason that's relevant is you can end up in situations where you've got like the comparative analysis between teammates, right? I feel like I'm 10% better than this person, and they got X amount of money, but I'm getting Y, which is less than X. What's the deal? Do I need to leave? Are you going to pay me more? What's the deal? Wow. And so that's been very difficult for a lot of schools and coaches to manage as well. As it's really changed the landscape of running a team as a team. Yeah.
Jeez.
Yep.
Well, what do you say to critics who argue that, we're kind of touching on this, that NIL could create locker room tension. I mean, that seems like that's what that is.
Yep. And I think there are certainly some teams where that's a huge challenge they're having to overcome. And I think on the flip side, what you're seeing is some teams are developing standardized ways to manage that sort of stuff.
Right.
And I think coming out of the House lawsuit, if it becomes legal to just reward on the field or on the court performance, that would make a big difference.
Yeah.
Right. Because what you're really trying to contract for now is promotional value. What's your name, image, and likeness worth? And I think if schools had it their way, you'd really be paying kids for how much production do you have on the field or on the court. That's what they would really love to pay for. The other thing I'll mention, though, is that while we're talking about NIL, there is some percentage of the kids that are getting big multi-million-dollar contracts or, several $100,000 contracts. There's some kids that NIL is just their saving grace. And I'll give you an example. I played football at Utah State almost 10 years ago now. I don't think Utah State has changed its stipend in about 20 years. So the stipend guys were getting in 2010 is the same one I got, is the same one athletes are getting now. And if you had to guess, I mean, as well as anyone, the cost of living has gone up substantially in the last 20 years.
Yeah.
Especially if you're talking about housing and food. I mean, for some of these kids, getting a $15,000 or a $20,000 NIL deal is enough for them just to make it and be comfortable. They're not getting rich. They're not going out and buying Lamborghinis and chains or whatever it is. It's actually really great for them, right? And it's allowing some people that even with a full ride may have not been able to make it previously to make it and get an education and play college sports. So there's a lot of good in it too, is what I want to make sure we don't exclude. But there's such a wide disparity between an athlete getting a $20,000 contract and another athlete getting a $7 million contract.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So you're actually meeting with prospective athletes?
Yeah. So that's, at the majority of the schools, the coaches do the recruiting, right? Mm-hmm. So NIL collectives, me, it's like we don't go out to games or do any of that sort of stuff. Like our NIL collective is run by volunteers. But then when these people come in and they have questions about how does an NIL collective work? How do you guys fundraise? What businesses are you partnered with? And then on the flip side, like, what are the expectations for my child? How many social media posts do they have to make? How many public appearances do they have to make? What kind of burden is that going to put on them in terms of, like, if this is their practice schedule and you're asking them to do Y, is there enough time in the day to realistically get that stuff done? So that's probably the most common, is either meeting with a parent or an athlete. What you're seeing a lot more of, in my experience, especially in the basketball space, women's or men's, is that these kids have their own version of an agent. And sometimes it is an NIL agent. And I've met with ones that I thought were very competent and professional. I've met with some that I thought were very incompetent and unprofessional. And then you have some that it's just like, maybe they don't have the resources to hire an agent, and they might not have, the greatest relationship with a parent or guardian. And so I've seen some where it's like an AAU, their basketball coach they've had since they were 10, like they're expecting their coach to try and negotiate for them. So yeah, I mean, it's a big piece of everything that goes on at a school in both attracting talent and then retaining talent, because the other reality of NIL these days is, let's say you put together a good roster and you make a run into the March Madness tournament. Well, the part of March Madness that's tough for NIL guys to watch these days is, if you have a guy on your roster that goes to the March Madness tournament and puts up 15 or 20 points a game, that they're going to start getting phone calls. And it probably shouldn't be that way, but they're going to start getting phone calls.
I'm thinking of a couple of players that I saw do that this time.
Yep. And they're getting 5 or 10 times as much money to go play at a bigger school.
Yeah.
Right. And a lot of times they go. Sometimes they don't, but a lot of times they do. And so that makes it really difficult as well, that, these kids do well, they're probably going to get poached. So retaining an athlete year over year theoretically becomes much, much more expensive.
Right. Wow. Do you see any red flags when you're meeting with somebody for the first time? Is there anything that, there's an old saying about, that first impressions. Do you ever have first impressions when you're meeting with an athlete or the family that you worry about this one?
Yeah. Number one is that even though money is a big part of this process, I think at least at our collective and at our school in general, we're very uninterested in people where money is the motivating factor.
Yeah.
And that shows up for a couple of reasons. But I think number one, first and foremost, is if you can effectively buy a player, if you can pay to get them here, they can be paid to leave.
Yeah.
Right? And that's the reality, is it's tough to run a school of our size if you're always in a bidding war. So that's probably number one.
Well, finish up that thought. And then I'm just wondering what you think for the future.
Okay. Yeah. I think the other thing is just, when money is the motivating factor, you lose some of the intangibles that you need in an athlete.
Yeah.
Because there's going to be times where, like, you're in the middle of spring practice and your coach is beating on you so hard that the money is not going to be enough to keep you there.
Yeah.
You need just those intangible, like, you need the grit, you need the hard work, you need the tenacity. You still need those things as an athlete to be able to perform on the field or on the court. And if money is the reason, you just tend not to get those.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Matt, where do I think this is going in the future?
Yeah, where do you think this is going?
Yeah, I'm hoping this is going to start to level out. I think what you're seeing in a lot of schools is they're starting to find the reality of the support in their respective community. And what I mean by that is, I actually think positioning, like physical positioning of a university, plays a pretty relevant part in their ability to sustain this going forward. obviously, if you have a good alumni network, you can pull donations from all over the country. But I think a school that's in, some smaller part of Montana, just by default, is not going to have the ability to fundraise like a school that's in Austin.
Right.
You're just not. There's not as many people. There's not as many businesses. There's not as much money. Okay.
Yeah.
And so I think these communities are starting to figure out like, oh, okay, well, our school realistically is only going to be able to sustain a fundraising clip of like $1 million a year, right? Because you always have a donor that'll come in and give 100,000 or 200,000, but the amount of donors that can do that every year is pretty low at most schools. Okay, and so these communities are starting to find that limit, and I think they're starting to structure their sports programs around that. And they're saying, okay, well, we can't support every sports program from an NIL perspective. So we're going to choose the one that we want to do the best, and we're just going to accept what happens to the other ones, right? That's number one. Number two is this revenue sharing piece that's coming out of the House settlement is going to be really important because schools can share revenue with the athletes. So if you're talking about enticing or retaining athletes in the future, the schools can have their hand in that. I think it still leaves a lot of question marks because there's some schools that frankly just do not have enough revenue or have no revenue, and they're effectively being supported by taxpayers in running their athletic department. And so even though the schools won't get the ability to pay NIL, it doesn't mean they will or that they'll have the money to, because some just will not. Okay. Yeah. With all of that being said, I think where it's going to end up is in some quasi shape like the NFL or the NBA, where you have some form of collective bargaining. The athletes can speak for themselves. They can negotiate their own terms. You have a better association than the NCAA, excuse me, which is standardized and has uniform rules across the entirety of the organization instead of state by state by state, because that's not working. And then I think at some point they probably realistically will have to put a hard cap on what you can expend at these schools, because if not, we're on a trajectory where it's pay to win, and there's going to be certain schools that can do it reliably year over year, and then there's going to be other schools that literally do not ever have a chance to compete. And I don't think that's what anyone wants in the college sports.
No, I wouldn't think so.
Yeah.
Well, you've got a lot to say about this, and we are running out of time. I'm thinking, let's wrap it up. I want your thoughts, as because you and I have been teaching about finances and investing and behavior. I want to see what your final thoughts are as a financial advisor and people in this age bracket and this kind of money and behavior, managing behavior.
Yeah. When I got into the industry as a young person, I thought it was going to be really easy to work with young people because
you're still a young person.
When I was younger, I thought it would be really easy to get young people to work with me because you could tell them, like, look, if you just do like $100 or $200 a month starting now, you're going to be in such good shape.
I know.
And it's so much easier than telling a 50-year-old, like, you have to put away $5,000 a month to retire. Right? That doesn't feel good to anybody.
No.
And what you're seeing for some of these kids, we've already talked about it, is they're getting good money. Right? And even if you're not getting the $1 million contract, you might be getting several $100,000. You might only be getting $50,000 or $60,000. But still, right? You imagine, realistically, you're at school, you have your scholarship, you have most of your food paid for or covered, you get your housing paid for, you have some small stipend that you can live off of. If a kid could save $40,000 or $50,000 a year for 3 or 4 years, you could have this $200,000 nest egg as a 22-year-old. Yeah. And that makes a big difference. I mean, that could be several $1 million when you go to retire.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You wouldn't even have to do anything if you just got it invested, had somebody help you take care of it, and made some good choices along the way. You're set, right? And I see some athletes that make good decisions. The problem is I see some athletes that make terrible decisions, right? And when I talked about it earlier, that in professional sports, you have professional level resources. Well, for some of these younger kids, you don't. You have an 18 or a 19-year-old that's getting a 6 or a 7-figure check. They don't even know what self-employment is. They don't know that they need to save some money up to pay taxes come next year. They don't know that they could be tracking their own expenses. They don't know how to manage mom and or dad or sister, or whoever else who's never had money before. And now we know we've got this pot of money in brother or sister that we can consistently draw on. And all of those sorts of issues, they probably don't have the right person to help them ask the right questions. And so, I mean, every young person that's getting NIL money, I wish they would find a good advisor, a good CPA, make sure you're saving some money to pay your taxes, and think long term, right? I hate when we're looking at, I could take this $50,000 and buy a cool car. You know? Yeah, you could. But you could also take the $50,000 and prepare yourself to be retired and have to do much, much less throughout the rest of your life.
Right.
And so, that's kind of my soapbox there for most of my athletes I talk to.
Well, I think that we do this again maybe in a year and do an update on what's happened with NIL. Yeah.
Well, depending on how this house settlement pans out, I think the landscape will be drastically different. And I also hope that in the meantime, more schools start to give their kids professional level resources to help them with this money that's coming into their lives.
So Dalton, on my podcast website, I have a place where it's called bonus downloads. And so we're going to have like a flyer type of thing. And so if there's anyone that's listening that wants to get in touch with you, I'm going to have your contact information there for them.
Yeah.
And so we are out of time. And so, man, it was like, oh my goodness. I think we hardly even touched the surface on the things you could discuss about this.
Yeah, that's no problem.
So thanks so much for joining me today. And this has just been a wonderful time to delve into something that I know a lot of people are very curious about. So thanks again for being here on Ask Good Questions.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks, Bonnie.
Okay.
Today's episode is over, but we did ask good questions again, didn't we? Don't miss out as we broadcast live every Wednesday, 6 p.m. Eastern Time on W4CY Radio at W4CY.com. Join Benita Bell Anderson next week for more conversations with experts on finances, retirement, behavioral finance issues, health and wellness, and more. Until then, remember to ask good questions.